Hey guys, what made medieval dirt so strange was that it was almost never just a sign of laziness or neglect. In many parts of medieval Europe, dirt was not something waiting to be cleaned away once people became sensible enough. It was part of the world itself, worked into the streets, the clothing, the houses, the food, the labor, and even the habits people used to keep themselves respectable. Before we settle in, let me know where you're watching from and which history topic you'd like me to cover next. And if you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, a quiet like on the video really does help support the channel. And subscribe as well, if you'd like more calm, quietly fascinating stories from the past. To understand why medieval people could never fully escape dirt, it helps to begin with a simple modern misunderstanding. People today often imagine dirt as something obvious and external, something that collects on a surface until it is washed away. But in the medieval world, dirt was rarely so separate. It was not just on things. It was between things, under things, carried by wind, water, boots, hooves, smoke, ash, and hands. It was made by ordinary life at such a constant pace that even a careful household could only manage it, never defeat it. That is part of what makes the subject more interesting than it first appears. The problem was not that medieval people were unaware of mess. They were often deeply aware of it. They swept floors, shook out bedding, beat dust from cloth, scraped mud from shoes, scattered fresh rushes, washed hands before meals when possible, and worried about foul smells with a seriousness that modern people sometimes underestimate. The real issue was that the conditions surrounding them produced dirt faster than any ordinary routine could remove it. A medieval town, even a prosperous one, was a place where the boundary between domestic life and public life remained thin. The road outside your door was not a sealed, drained, carefully regulated surface. It was a changing mixture of churned earth, straw, waste, spilled water, animal droppings, scraps from market activity, soot, and rain. In dry weather, it became dust. In wet weather, it became mud. In winter, it might harden into ruts and filth. In spring, it softened again into a kind of slow, sticky movement underfoot. Every boot that entered a house brought some of that world indoors. And of course, boots were not the only problem. Horses, oxen, dogs, pigs, carts, and people all moved through the same spaces. In many towns, animals were not politely kept out of sight as they are in the modern imagination. They were part of urban life. A pig rooting through refuse was not an unusual interruption to city order. It was part of how the city functioned. Animals ate waste, produced more waste, and carried the countryside into town quite literally on their bodies and hooves. A person leaving home in the morning might pass a butcher's stall, a muddy lane, a ditch carrying runoff, a midden heap, and a row of workshops all within a short walk. None of this would have seemed remarkable. It was simply the texture of ordinary life. Inside the home, matters did improve, but not as much as we might hope. Medieval floors were often difficult to keep clean in any lasting sense. In poorer households, they might be packed earth, which could be swept but never quite purified. In somewhat better homes, there might be planks or tiles, yet even these surfaces existed in rooms heated by open hearths or smoky fires. Ash settled, soot drifted, grease from cooking found its way into the air and onto nearby surfaces. Rushes or herbs spread on the floor could freshen a room for a time and soften the feel of the ground. But they also trapped crumbs, dirt, dampness, and whatever was carried in from outside. If such coverings were not changed often enough, they became part of the problem they were meant to ease. This is where the medieval relationship with cleanliness becomes especially revealing. Many people did value freshness, order, and bodily care, but they lived in a material environment that resisted lasting cleanliness at nearly every level. Fire warmed the home, but blackened it. Animals fed the family, but fouled the yard. Cloth protected the body, but trapped dust and sweat. Water cleaned, but clean water was not always close, plentiful, or safely separated from other forms of use. The very structures that made life possible also made dirt unavoidable. Water itself deserves careful attention, because modern viewers often imagine it as the obvious answer. Why not simply wash more often? Why not scrub streets, floors, and bodies until the problem was gone? But medieval water was never just water. It was labor. It had to be carried, stored, heated, rationed, and protected. A household without easy access to a fresh source might depend on a well, a cistern, a stream, or water cellars. Carrying enough for cooking alone could be tiring. Adding regular deep cleaning to that burden was not impossible, but it was costly in time and strength. For a woman running a household, or servants managing a large one, or laborers already exhausted by work, every extra bucket had a weight attached to it in the most literal sense. And even when water was available, it was not always wise to splash it generously through living spaces. Mud indoors could become worse before it became better. Dampness lingered, wood warped, straw and rushes soured, clothing dried slowly in cold weather. A washed garment was not immediately a clean garment in the modern sense. It was something that now needed space, air, and time. In a crowded dwelling, especially in poor weather, drying itself became a difficulty. So medieval cleaning practices often leaned toward maintenance rather than complete renewal. People brushed, aired, shook, scraped, wrung, and wiped. They managed dirt as a recurring companion. That recurring quality shaped the body as well. Skin became dusty from roads, smoky from fires, and greasy from labor. Hands were always meeting rough materials. Wool, leather, grain, soil, tools, wax, fish, hides, wood shavings, animal feed. A person could wash and still return within minutes to the conditions that made washing temporary. Even those with access to baths or more elaborate routines could not remove themselves from the larger environment that kept remaking the problem. Clothing makes this especially easy to imagine. Medieval garments were valuable. Even ordinary clothes represented work, fabric, repair, and expense. They were not disposable layers to be casually changed several times a day. A tunic, gown, cloak, hose, apron, or hood had to endure repeated use, and laundering some of these items was a demanding task. Soap existed, but it was not a magical industrial cleaner. Full washing could shrink wool, damage dyes, strain seams, or simply require more labor than a household could spare often. So clothes were brushed, aired, beaten, mended, and protected. Outer layers helped absorb some of the grime of the world, but they also gathered it. Dust settled in folds. Smoke entered fibers. Mud climbed hems. Rain left marks. Grease transferred from work to sleeves and cuffs. Dirt was not merely encountered. It was worn. This is one of the reasons medieval status could sometimes be seen not in the total absence of dirt, but in the ability to manage it better. Wealthier households had more servants, more space, better materials, more changes of linen, and more opportunities to keep the visible edges of life cleaner. Fresh linen, in particular, mattered. It sat next to the skin, could be washed more often than heavy outer garments, and signaled care, refinement, and means. But even here the point is not that the rich escaped dirt altogether. They were simply better positioned to keep it at a distance from the most socially visible surfaces of the body. Cleanliness became a kind of buffer, not a full victory. And linen reveals another quiet truth about the medieval world. People often understood that what lay closest to the body mattered. They may not have shared modern germ theory, but they recognized discomfort, smell, dampness, and the stale feeling of used cloth. They noticed when rooms became close, when bedding soured, when garments felt rank. Medieval people did not need modern science to know that some kinds of dirt seemed unhealthy, degrading, or morally troubling. The difference was that they explained these sensations through the ideas available to them: balance, corruption, foul air, putrefaction, disorder, or sin. Their vocabulary differed, but their discomfort was very real. Bedding offers another way into the subject. A bed might sound like the cleanest place in a house, a retreat from the street and the workshop. But beds were vulnerable to dust, smoke, dampness, fleas, body oils, and the ordinary limitations of medieval housing. Mattresses could be stuffed with straw, wool, flock, feathers, or other materials that were not easy to strip and sanitize in any modern sense. Curtains around a bed could keep out drafts, but they also held stale air and dust. Sheets and blankets were precious goods, washed when possible, aired when weather allowed, and reused carefully. The bed could feel warm, secure, and private by medieval standards, while still being far from clean in the modern one. That gap between relative comfort and actual cleanliness is important. Medieval people often aimed not for sterile perfection, which would have been unimaginable, but for a workable state of order within a dirty world. A room might be considered properly kept if it was swept, arranged, and reasonably fresh-smelling, even if soot darkened the beams and mud clung near the threshold. A person might be considered respectable if their linen was decent and their appearance orderly, even if roads, weather, and labor made some level of grime inevitable. Their standards were not meaningless. They were adapted to reality. The same was true in monasteries, castles, farms, and towns, though in different ways. A monastery might enforce routines of washing and order, yet monks still lived in stone buildings that gathered cold, damp, smoke, and dust. A castle projected grandeur, but its walls trapped soot from torches and hearths. Its halls admitted mud from men, dogs, horses, and servants, and its kitchens produced endless grease, ash, and scraps. A peasant cottage was smaller and humbler, but perhaps even more vulnerable to the closeness of people, animals, and stored supplies. Grain dust, loose straw, smoke, damp wool, and manure from nearby enclosures all formed part of the air and surfaces of daily life. And outside, the seasons kept rewriting the problem. Summer dust could settle over everything. Harvest brought chaff and field dirt into clothes and hair. Autumn rains turned paths into slick channels. Winter meant smoke-heavy interiors, fewer chances to dry bedding properly, and floors under strain from wet footwear and constant traffic. Spring thaw did not cleanse the world so much as release what winter had frozen in place. When the ground softened, so did the accumulated mess of months. Medieval dirt was seasonal but never absent. This is one reason modern viewers sometimes misunderstand historical bathing. The question is often framed too narrowly, as if the issue were simply whether people liked being clean. But bodily washing was only one small front in a much larger battle against environment, infrastructure, labor, and material limits. A person might wash their face and hands, comb their hair, clean visible linen, and still inhabit spaces where smoke, mud, and organic waste constantly remade the conditions around them. The cleaner the person tried to be, the more they might notice how impossible complete cleanliness really was. There is also a social side to all of this. Dirt was not just physical. It could carry meanings about status, labor, morality, and exclusion. Certain forms of dirt were tolerated because they came from honest work. Others were condemned because they suggested neglect, vice, or disorder. A plowman covered in earth was not the same as a beggar crusted in the residues of the street, at least not in the social imagination of the time. Likewise, a kitchen worker smeared with flour and grease occupied a different moral space from someone whose filth seemed to signal abandonment or corruption. Medieval society did not simply divide the world into clean and dirty. It made distinctions, some practical, some cruel, some surprisingly subtle. The church, too, added another layer. Religious language often treated purity and corruption in moral or spiritual terms, yet this did not mean people ignored bodily realities. Rather, the two could overlap in complicated ways. A foul smell, rotting matter, or polluted environment could suggest danger to body and soul at once. Clean linen for the altar, washed hands before certain rituals, and concern for decay all reveal that medieval people could be attentive to material cleanliness without imagining that the world itself could ever be fully rid of filth. The earthly realm remained stubborn, fallen, unstable, and that may be the deepest reason they could never escape dirt. Dirt was not merely a housekeeping problem. It was woven into a society where most goods came close to raw nature before they came close to human refinement. Food arrived feathered, muddy, scaled, bloodied, husked, or rooted. Fuel arrived as wood, peat, dung, or charcoal. Homes were made of timber, stone, plaster, thatch, and earth. Work was done by hand. Roads were not sealed. Drainage was uneven. Animals lived near people. Fire was everywhere. Dust came from floors, lofts, cloth, and grain. Smell came from kitchens, privies, stables, gutters, and bodies. Cleanliness was always temporary because life itself was materially dense and stubbornly physical. What is striking is not that medieval people failed some modern test. What is striking is how much order they created within those conditions. They developed habits, expectations, and routines that made life tolerable and sometimes even dignified. They aired rooms. They valued fresh rushes and clean linen. They built drains where they could, imposed local rules about dumping waste, punished some nuisances, and tried repeatedly to control what overflowed from household to street. Town governments issued regulations. Households established routines. Religious houses set standards. Again and again, people attempted to push back, but the pressure always returned. A rainfall undid yesterday's sweeping. A herd passed through the lane. A workshop spilled refuse. A child tracked mud across a floor. A roof leaked. Smoke clung to cloth. Fleas found bedding. The pig got loose. The ditch clogged. The cart will deepen the rut. The river that carried away waste also brought back its own forms of contamination. Medieval dirt was resilient because it belonged to systems, not accidents. And once you see that, the subject becomes less amusing and more revealing. Dirt was a clue to how closely medieval people lived to the processes that sustained them. Their world was not sealed off behind clean surfaces and hidden pipes. Production, waste, warmth, food, labor, and decay remained visible. People slept near the smoke that heated them, walked through the muck made by the animals that fed them, and handled the materials that kept them clothed and alive. The dirt was unpleasant, yes, but it also exposed the structure of the world, which means the story is not only about filth. It is also about nearness. Nearness to labor, to weather, to animals, to fuel, to bodily need, to the limits of technology, and to the rhythms of a society that could tidy and regulate, but never fully separate itself from the messiness of survival. And once that nearness is in view, even ordinary medieval spaces begin to look different, because the street, the hearth, the bed, the garment, and the meal all start to tell the same story in different forms. The threshold of the home, in particular, becomes more interesting the longer you linger there, because it was at that threshold that medieval people fought perhaps their most constant and most unwinnable little war. The doorway, in many ways, was not just an entrance, but a boundary that had to be negotiated again and again throughout the day. Every person who stepped inside carried the outside world with them in small, almost invisible ways, on the edges of their shoes, along the hem of a cloak, in the folds of fabric, on their hands, and even in their hair. A clean interior could only exist for a short while before that boundary was crossed again. This is why so many small, repetitive actions took on quiet importance. Shoes were scraped, sometimes against a stone or wooden edge. Cloaks were shaken out. Hands were wiped, if not fully washed. A servant or household member might sweep near the entrance more often than anywhere else, not because it stayed clean, but because it did not. The doorway gathered the outside in concentrated form, becoming a place where the effort to maintain order was most visibly tested. And yet, even here, the idea of a perfectly clean threshold was almost unimaginable. There were no rubber mats, no sealed floors, no reliable barriers that could isolate one space from another. Wind carried dust through cracks and gaps. Rain splashed mud upward from the ground. In colder months, dampness lingered around entrances, softening wood and thickening the dirt into something heavier, more stubborn. The act of entering a home was never a neutral moment. It was a transfer. In wealthier homes, this transfer could be softened. An entrance hall, a paved surface, or additional layers of flooring might reduce the immediate impact. Servants could be tasked with keeping these areas as orderly as possible. But even then, the principle remained the same. Dirt did not wait politely outside. It moved with people, with animals, with weather, and with the ordinary business of life. Over time, this constant movement created a kind of rhythm that medieval households learned to live with. Cleanliness was not a fixed state but a temporary condition, something achieved and then gradually undone. A floor might be swept in the morning, only to show the marks of the day by midday. A bench wiped clean might collect dust again before evening. A garment brushed and aired might still carry the scent of smoke or labor. This rhythm shaped expectations in subtle ways. People did not expect permanence. They expected effort. A well-kept home was not one that remained untouched by dirt, but one where someone was clearly working against it. The signs of care mattered. The swept corner, the arranged table, the folded cloth, the fresh rushes underfoot. These signals communicated order, respectability, and attention, even if the deeper layers of the environment remained unchanged. And those deeper layers were difficult to reach. Consider the walls themselves. In many buildings, walls were not smooth, sealed surfaces. They could be rough, porous, sometimes coated with plaster or lime wash, but still vulnerable to smoke, moisture, and gradual staining. Over time, soot from hearth fires settled into their texture. This was not an occasional accident, but a constant process. Every fire that warmed the room also left behind a trace of itself. The ceiling or the beams above often carried even more of this accumulation. Smoke rises, and in a space where fire is used daily, that upward movement becomes a slow, steady coating. In some cases, this darkening was accepted as normal, even inevitable. It was part of what a lived-in space looked like. Attempts to clean it were possible, but limited. The structure itself participated in the persistence of dirt. The same could be said for the air. It is easy to forget that medieval interiors were filled not just with visible particles, but with suspended ones. Fine ash, dust from textiles, fragments of straw, particles from cooking, and the constant presence of smoke created an atmosphere that was rarely clear in the modern sense. Light entering through a window or doorway would often reveal this, catching tiny drifting particles that moved almost invisibly until illuminated. Breathing this air was simply part of life. It was not something most people could choose to avoid, and over time, it settled on surfaces, clothing, skin, and food. A table laid for a meal might appear clean, yet still receive a fine layer of dust or ash before the meal was finished. A pot left near the hearth would gather soot even as it was used. Cleanliness existed, but it was always partial, always temporary, always under quiet pressure. Food itself, which we often imagine as a refuge from dirt, was deeply entangled in it. Grain had to be ground, often producing fine dust. Vegetables came from soil that clung to roots and leaves. Meat came from animals that lived in close proximity to people, processed in conditions that were practical rather than sterile. Kitchens were places of transformation, but also of accumulation. Grease, smoke, scraps, and residue built up over time, requiring constant attention to prevent them from becoming overwhelming. Utensils could be cleaned, of course, but even this process reveals something about the limits of the environment. Washing a pot did not return it to a pristine state. It removed the most immediate residue, preparing it for use again, but the deeper marks of repeated cooking remained. Wood absorbed oils, metal darkened, cloth retained traces of its past use. Cleanliness was functional, not absolute. Even water used for cleaning could carry its own complications. A bucket drawn from a source might already contain sediment, or it might become contaminated during use. Reusing water was common, especially in households where resources had to be carefully managed. This meant that cleaning was often a process of degrees rather than total removal. Something became cleaner, but not entirely clean. All of this creates a picture that is less about failure and more about adaptation. Medieval people were not passively living in dirt. They were actively negotiating it using the tools, knowledge, and time available to them. They understood which forms of dirt were tolerable, which were dangerous, and which required immediate attention. They developed habits that balanced effort with necessity, creating a kind of practical cleanliness that made daily life workable. And yet, there were moments when this balance was disrupted. Heavy rain, for instance, could transform a familiar street into a shifting, unstable surface, sending water and mud into places that had just been swept. A broken drain could overflow, spreading waste into areas that were normally passable. A crowded market day could leave behind layers of debris that took time to clear. In these moments, the underlying fragility of order became more visible. The systems that kept dirt at bay were not strong enough to prevent it entirely. They could only respond. This is where communal effort sometimes entered the picture. Town authorities, guilds, or local agreements might require certain areas to be cleaned, certain wastes to be removed, certain behaviors to be avoided. There were attempts to regulate dumping, to maintain drains, to keep streets usable. But enforcement was uneven, and the scale of the problem often exceeded the capacity of these measures. Dirt was not just an individual issue. It was shared, moving through spaces that belonged to many people at once. And because it was shared, it could not be easily assigned to a single source. The dirt in a street did not belong to one household. It came from many. The smoke in the air did not come from one hearth. It came from all of them. The condition of a space was shaped by the combined actions of a community, making control both necessary and difficult. This collective dimension also meant that escaping dirt entirely would have required a level of separation that medieval society did not provide. To be truly free of it, one would need not just a clean room, but a clean street, a clean water source, a clean air supply, and a clean system of waste removal. Such a system was far beyond what most places could sustain consistently. And so, even as individuals and households maintained their own standards, they remained connected to a wider environment that continually reintroduced the very conditions they were trying to manage. The effort to stay clean was real, but it was always part of a larger, more complicated picture that in quieter moments, perhaps in the early morning before the day's activity began. A room might feel almost still, almost fresh. The floor newly swept, the air cooler, the surfaces arranged. For a brief time, the work of the previous day might seem to have held. But even then, the first steps across the threshold, the first stirring of the fire, the first movement of people and animals outside, would begin to change that state again. And it is in that slow, almost unnoticed transition, from temporary order back into the ordinary mixture of use, movement, and accumulation, that the deeper reality of medieval dirt reveals itself most clearly. Because it was never a single problem to be solved once. It was a condition that returned with every hour of living, reshaping itself with each season, each task, and each small, ordinary act that kept the medieval world in motion. And nowhere was that more evident than in the places where people slept, because as the day's labor ended and the body finally withdrew from the open world, the question of what, exactly, one was lying down into became harder to ignore. A medieval bed was not a sealed or protected space. It was, in many ways, simply a softer arrangement of the same materials that filled the rest of the house. Straw, wool, feathers, or rags were gathered into a mattress or ticking, shaped and layered to provide some measure of comfort, but never fully isolated from the environment around it. Whatever moved through the room during the day, dust, smoke, fragments of fabric, fine particles of ash, had the same quiet access to the bed as it did to the floor or the table. And unlike a surface that could be wiped or swept, the interior of a mattress held onto what entered it. This is where the idea of medieval cleanliness begins to shift again, because a bed could be carefully arranged, smoothed, and aired, and still contain the accumulated presence of weeks or months of use. Straw stuffing, for instance, might be replaced or refreshed, but not constantly. Wool and feather fillings could be shaken and redistributed, but they could not be easily stripped down and fully cleaned in a modern sense. The bed absorbed the life around it, slowly, quietly, and with very little opportunity for complete renewal. Bedding itself, sheets, blankets, coverings, offered some degree of separation, but even these layers had limits. Linen sheets could be washed more frequently than heavier materials, and their freshness mattered deeply. They sat against the skin, providing a sense of cleanliness even when the broader environment remained unchanged. But linen, too, depended on water, labor, and drying conditions. A washed sheet required space and time to dry properly, and in colder or wetter seasons, that process could be slow and imperfect. So while a bed might be remade, aired, or refreshed, it was never truly reset. It carried the memory of previous nights, previous bodies, previous seasons. And this is where the experience of sleep itself becomes more revealing. We often imagine rest as a retreat from discomfort, a moment when the body escapes the pressures of the day. But in the medieval world, sleep existed within the same conditions as waking life. The body did not leave the environment behind. It remained within it, breathing the same air, surrounded by the same materials, resting on surfaces that had been shaped by ongoing use. Warmth, for instance, was essential. A cold bed was not simply uncomfortable. It could be dangerous. Curtains, hangings, and enclosed bed frames helped trap heat, creating a more controlled space within the room. But these same features also reduced airflow. Stale air lingered. Odors remained. Dust and fine particles settled into enclosed spaces where movement was limited. The effort to create warmth often meant accepting a more concentrated form of the surrounding environment. And then there were the smaller, more persistent inhabitants of the bed itself. Fleas, lice, and other parasites were not unusual intrusions. They were part of the broader ecological reality of medieval life. Animals, clothing, bedding, and the close proximity of people all contributed to their presence. A bed, warm and regularly occupied, provided an ideal environment for them to persist. Attempts were made to manage them, through washing, airing, herbal treatments, or simple vigilance, but like dirt itself, they could not be permanently removed. This is not to suggest that medieval people simply accepted discomfort without resistance. On the contrary, they noticed it acutely. The irritation of a bite, the restlessness of an uneasy night, the awareness of something moving unseen beneath the surface. These were all part of lived experience. But again, the issue was not ignorance. It was limitation. The tools available could reduce the problem, but not eliminate it. Even the act of sharing a bed adds another layer to this picture. In many households, beds were not private spaces reserved for a single individual or even a single pair. Space was valuable and warmth was shared. Family members, servants, or travelers might sleep in close proximity, sometimes in the same bed, sometimes in the same room. Each additional body brought warmth, but also movement, breath, and the small transfers of dirt and material that came with daily life. Clothing worn during the day might not be fully removed before sleep, especially in colder conditions. Layers that had been exposed to the outside world were brought directly into the bed, carrying with them whatever they had gathered. Even when garments were changed, the body itself retained traces of the day's labor. Dust in the hair, residue on the skin, the lingering scent of smoke or work. All of this meant that the boundary between day and night was more porous than we might expect. Sleep did not mark a complete transition into a clean, separate state. It was a continuation, quieter perhaps, but still connected to the same environment. And yet, within these conditions, people still found ways to create moments of comfort, even a sense of refuge. A well-arranged bed, fresh linen, a carefully placed covering, the familiar shape of a sleeping space. These details mattered. They offered a form of control within an uncontrollable system. The bed might not be clean in the modern sense, but it could still be made orderly, welcoming, and, in its own way, reassuring. This tension between what could be improved and what could not runs through the entire experience. For instance, airing bedding was a common practice when weather allowed. Mattresses might be lifted, shaken, or exposed to sunlight. Sheets and coverings could be hung outside, allowing air and light to pass through them. These actions did not eliminate dirt entirely, but they changed it. They reduced dampness, dispersed odors, and interrupted the accumulation of certain materials. The effect was noticeable even if it was temporary. Similarly, certain herbs were used for their scent or their perceived ability to repel unwanted pests. These might be placed within bedding, scattered across floors, or hung in small bundles. Again, the goal was not perfection but improvement. A room that smelled fresh, even briefly, was a room that felt more livable. And this idea of feeling is important. Medieval cleanliness was often judged through the senses: sight, smell, touch. A surface that looked orderly, a room that smelled acceptable, a garment that felt dry and reasonably fresh. These were meaningful indicators. They shaped how people experienced their surroundings, even if the deeper realities remained unchanged. In this way, the bed becomes a kind of meeting point between effort and limitation. It reflects everything that has come before: the dirt carried through the threshold, the dust in the air, the smoke from the hearth, the materials of the house, and everything that people tried to do in response. It is both a product of the environment and an attempt to soften it. And when morning came, the process began again. The bed was not left untouched. It was straightened, perhaps aired, perhaps adjusted. The room returned to activity. People rose, dressed, moved, worked. The quiet of the night gave way to the familiar rhythm of the day, and with it, the gradual reintroduction of everything that had been momentarily stilled. This cycle, use, effort, partial renewal, and return, extended far beyond the bed. It defined the entire relationship between medieval people and their environment, because dirt, in the end, was not just something that entered a space. It was something that was constantly being made within it. Every act of cooking, every step across a floor, every movement of cloth, every breath near a fire, every animal passing through a yard, every tool striking its material. All of these produced small changes, small residues, small additions to the environment that accumulated over time. And once we begin to see dirt in that way, not as an external intrusion but as a byproduct of life itself, the problem becomes much more difficult to separate from the solution. Because the same actions that sustained medieval life were also the ones that ensured its spaces would never remain clean for long. Which is why, when we move from the bed back into the wider structure of the house, the question begins to shift again. Not just how dirt entered or where it settled, but how the very design of medieval homes quietly determined the paths it would take next. A medieval house did not simply contain dirt. It guided it. The layout of space, where the fire was placed, where people moved, where animals might be kept, where food was prepared, where tools were stored, created natural routes along which dirt traveled. These routes were not planned in the modern sense, but they emerged from necessity. And once they formed, they became part of the daily rhythm, shaping how and where accumulation occurred. The hearth, for example, was often the central point of the home, both physically and socially. Provided heat, light, and a place to cook. But it also produced ash, soot, sparks, and fine particles that spread outward in subtle ways. Even in homes with chimneys, which became more common over time, smoke was not perfectly contained. It drifted, curled, and settled. The closer a surface was to the fire, the more it absorbed. This created a gradient of dirt within the room. Near the hearth, surfaces might be darker, more heavily marked by use. Further away, the accumulation might be lighter, but still present. Over time, these differences became part of the visual character of the space. A beam above the fire told a different story than a beam near a window. A wall near the cooking area bore different traces than one near a sleeping corner. And movement reinforced these patterns. People naturally gathered near warmth, near food, near light. These were the busiest areas, and therefore the ones most affected by constant use. Foot traffic wore paths into floors, whether of earth, wood, or stone. In an earthen floor, this could mean slight depressions where people walked most often. In a wooden floor, it might mean smoother, darker boards where repeated contact had altered the surface. These paths were not just marks of movement. They were channels of transfer. Dirt brought in from outside did not spread evenly across a room. It followed the same routes as people. From the doorway to the hearth, from the hearth to the table, from the table to the sleeping area, each step carried small amounts of the outside world further inward. And because these routes were used repeatedly, the accumulation became layered. What was brought in one day was not entirely removed before more arrived the next. Sweeping could reduce the visible layer, but it could not erase the pattern itself. The house remembered where people moved. Storage areas added another dimension. Food, tools, and materials were not sealed away in isolated compartments. They were part of the living space. Sacks of grain, bundles of herbs, tools for work, containers of liquids. All of these contributed their own forms of residue. Grain dust settled in corners. Herbs shed small fragments. Tools carried traces of their use. Liquids spilled or seeped. The house was not just a place of consumption. It was a place of ongoing production and storage, and each of those activities left its mark. The presence of animals, whether inside or immediately outside the dwelling, further complicated the picture. In some homes, especially in rural settings, animals might share space with people, particularly in colder months. This arrangement provided warmth and security, but it also brought with it the realities of animal life: hair, droppings, moisture, and the constant movement of bodies that did not distinguish between clean and unclean areas. Even when animals were kept outside, their influence did not end at the threshold. The yard itself was a zone of transition, often muddy, often active, often filled with the byproducts of daily work. Crossing it was unavoidable, and whatever it contained was carried into the home in small, persistent amounts. And then there is the matter of waste. which reveals perhaps the most direct connection between household design and the persistence of dirt. Medieval sanitation systems, where they existed, were varied and often limited. Privies, cesspits, and other arrangements were used to manage human waste, but they required maintenance, and their effectiveness depended on location, construction, and use. In urban areas, waste might be collected and removed, but not always with the regularity or thoroughness we would expect. In some cases, it might be disposed of in streets, drains, or nearby areas, contributing to the broader environment that people had to navigate. Within the house, the handling of waste, whether from cooking, cleaning, or other activities, required constant decisions. Where to place it, when to remove it, how far to carry it, each choice had practical consequences. A delay in removal could mean a buildup. A poorly chosen location could affect air, water, or movement. These were not abstract concerns. They were immediate and tangible. And yet, it would be a mistake to imagine medieval people as indifferent to these issues. There is ample evidence of concern, regulation, and effort. Town ordinances might prohibit certain kinds of dumping. Households might establish routines for clearing waste. Communities might organize collective cleaning efforts. These actions suggest an awareness that the environment could become unlivable if left entirely unchecked. But again, the scale of the challenge was larger than any single measure could fully address. The design of the house, the materials used, the proximity of activities, the limits of infrastructure, all of these factors combined to create a system in which dirt was constantly generated and only partially controlled. Even the best-kept home existed within a wider network that continually reintroduced the problem. And this brings us to a quieter, more subtle point, one that often goes unnoticed. The medieval house was not designed with the expectation of total separation between clean and dirty spaces. Instead, it was designed to accommodate a range of activities within a shared environment. Cooking, eating, working, sleeping, storing, and sometimes even housing animals all took place within overlapping zones. The boundaries between these activities were flexible, shifting according to need. This flexibility was practical. It allowed households to adapt to changing conditions, to make efficient use of limited space, to respond to weather, to manage labor. But it also meant that dirt did not remain confined to a single area. It moved with the activities that produced it. A meal prepared at the hearth left traces in the air and on nearby surfaces. A tool used indoors brought in material from outside. A garment worn during work carried its environment into the resting space. Each activity blurred the distinction between one part of the house and another. And over time, this blurring became normal. It shaped how people understood their surroundings. Cleanliness was not about isolating a single pure space, but about maintaining a workable balance across all of them. This balance could be delicate. A disruption in one area could affect others. A spill near the hearth might spread underfoot. A leak in the roof could dampen bedding. A buildup of waste in the yard could influence the air inside. The house functioned as a connected system where changes in one part resonated through the rest. And this interconnectedness extended beyond the house itself. The street, the yard, the workshop, the field, these were not separate worlds but extensions of the same environment. People moved between them constantly, carrying with them the materials and conditions of each. The house did not stand apart from this network. It was embedded within it, which means that any attempt to understand medieval dirt must move beyond individual habits and into the structure of life itself. It must consider not just what people did, but where they did it, how they moved, what they used, and what they lacked. Because in the end, the persistence of dirt was not simply the result of insufficient effort. It was the result of a world in which the boundaries we take for granted, between inside and outside, between clean and dirty, between production and rest, were far more fluid. And once those boundaries begin to blur, the question is no longer just how dirt entered the home, but how it was carried through an entire way of life, moving from street to threshold, from threshold to hearth, from hearth to bed, and back again with each passing day. It is in that continuous movement, that quiet circulation, that the full character of the medieval environment begins to emerge. Because dirt did not simply settle and stay. It moved, it shifted, it returned, and it followed the same paths as the people who lived among it, shaping and reshaping the spaces they thought they understood, often in ways that only became visible when something interrupted the pattern. When a season changed, when a system failed, or when a new idea began slowly to alter how people imagined the possibility of living differently. At first, these changes were not dramatic. They did not arrive as a sudden transformation, but as small adjustments in how certain problems were understood. One of the most important of these shifts concerned the relationship between dirt and health, an idea that, in the medieval world, was never entirely absent, but was interpreted through a different set of assumptions. People had long noticed that certain places felt worse than others. A room that was close, damp, and poorly aired could feel oppressive. A street that collected stagnant water or waste might carry an unpleasant, even unsettling smell. A pile of refuse left too long seemed to change, not just in appearance but in character, becoming something more troubling than simple disorder. These observations did not require modern science. They came from the senses, from lived experience. But what those observations meant, and how they were explained, shaped what could be done in response. Medieval thinking often connected these conditions to the idea of bad air, or miasma, a form of invisible corruption that could spread from decaying matter, stagnant water, or unclean environments. This did not mean that people understood disease in the way we do now, but it did mean they recognized that certain kinds of dirt were not merely unpleasant, but potentially harmful in ways that were difficult to see. And this belief, while not always precise, encouraged certain behaviors. Air became something to manage. Windows were opened when possible, not just for light, but for movement. Rooms were aired out, especially after periods of close use. In larger buildings, efforts were made to improve ventilation, though these were often limited by the structure itself. The idea was not to eliminate dirt entirely, but to prevent it from becoming stagnant, from settling into a form that seemed more dangerous. Smell, in particular, took on a kind of diagnostic role. A foul odor was not simply offensive. It was suspicious. It suggested that something was wrong, that matter had begun to decay or transform in ways that might affect the body. As a result, masking or improving smell became part of managing the environment. Herbs, flowers, and aromatic substances were used not only for pleasure, but for what was believed to be their protective qualities. This leads to an interesting tension. On the one hand, people were surrounded by dirt that could not be fully removed. On the other, they were developing ways of interpreting and responding to that dirt that gave them some sense of control. These responses did not eliminate the problem, but they shaped how it was experienced. And gradually, in certain places, these responses began to influence how spaces were organized. For example, the separation of certain activities became more deliberate over time. Cooking, sleeping, storage, and work did not always occur in completely shared spaces, especially in wealthier households. Where possible, rooms were designated for specific purposes, reducing some of the overlap that had previously allowed dirt to move so freely between activities. This was not universal, and it did not happen everywhere at the same pace. But where it did occur, it began to change the internal flow of the house. Dirt still entered, still accumulated, still persisted, but its paths became slightly more defined, slightly more contained. Similarly, improvements in building techniques began, slowly, to alter the relationship between interior and exterior. Better flooring materials, more effective roofing, and the gradual spread of chimneys all contributed to a subtle shift. Smoke, for instance, could be directed more reliably out of the living space, reducing one of the most constant sources of indoor residue. But even here, the change was partial. A chimney reduced smoke, but did not eliminate it. A wooden floor could be swept more easily than packed earth, but still collected dust and debris. A separate room for sleeping might feel cleaner, but it remained connected to the same household, the same yard, the same street. The improvements mattered, but they did not break the underlying pattern. And perhaps most importantly, these changes were uneven. A prosperous urban household might experience a different level of control than a rural cottage. A monastery might enforce routines that a small family could not sustain. A castle might invest in structural improvements that were far beyond the reach of ordinary people. The medieval world was not uniform, and neither was its relationship with dirt. In many places, the older patterns remained dominant. Fields still produced mud that clung to boots. Animals still moved between spaces. Water still had to be carried. Waste still had to be managed by hand. Fire still filled rooms with heat and residue. The daily reality of life continued to generate the same pressures, even as ideas and techniques began to shift. And this creates a kind of layered experience. On the surface, small improvements could be seen. A cleaner floor here, a better ventilated room there, a more carefully managed yard. But beneath that surface, the deeper system continued to operate much as it always had. Dirt was still being made, still being moved, still being reintroduced. It is in this layered reality that we begin to see something more complex than a simple story of progress. Because the medieval relationship with dirt was not static, but it was also not easily transformed. It changed in increments influenced by ideas, resources, and circumstances, but always constrained by the fundamental conditions of the time. And those conditions were not only physical but social. Who cleaned, who carried, who maintained order? These were questions tied to labor, status, and expectation. In larger households, servants took on much of the daily work of managing dirt. Their labor was constant, often unnoticed, and essential to maintaining even the appearance of cleanliness. In smaller households, the burden fell directly on those who lived there, woven into the rhythm of daily tasks. This labor was repetitive, ongoing, and never fully complete. A floor swept in the morning would need attention again by evening. Bedding aired one day would still require care the next. Waste removed from one area would accumulate elsewhere. The work did not end because the source of the work, life itself, did not end. And this is where the experience becomes quietly revealing. Because the persistence of dirt meant that people were always aware, at some level, of the limits of their control. They could improve their surroundings, manage them, shape them to a degree, but they could not fully separate themselves from the material processes that sustained them. In a modern setting, many of these processes are hidden. Waste is carried away through systems that are rarely seen. Water arrives without visible effort. Air can be filtered, surfaces sealed, environments controlled. Dirt still exists, of course, but it is often displaced, removed from immediate awareness. In the medieval world, that distance did not exist. Dirt remained close. It remained visible. It remained part of the texture of daily life. And because of that, it also remained a constant reminder of the physical nature of the world, of decay, of labor, of the passage of time. Objects wore down. Materials changed. Surfaces aged. What was new became used. What was clean became marked. What was ordered became disordered. These changes were not hidden. They were experienced directly. And this direct experience shaped how people thought about their environment, their bodies, and their place within the world. It encouraged a kind of practical realism, a recognition that effort mattered, but that perfection was not the goal, that cleanliness was desirable, but always temporary, that the world was something to be managed, not mastered. And yet, even within this realism, there were moments, small, often fleeting, when the possibility of something different began to emerge. a newly built structure that kept out rain more effectively, a redesigned hearth that reduced smoke, a set of rules that kept a street clearer than before, a household routine that maintained a higher standard of order. These moments did not overturn the system, but they hinted at alternatives. They suggested that the relationship between people and their environment was not entirely fixed. And as these hints accumulated, slowly, unevenly, they began to influence not just what people did, but what they expected. Because once a slightly cleaner space had been experienced, even briefly, it became something that could be imagined again. Once a room had felt fresher, a street more passable, a bed more comfortable, the memory of that state lingered. It created a subtle comparison, a quiet awareness that things could be otherwise, even if only for a time. And it is in that space between what was normal and what seemed possible that the story begins to move in a new direction, one shaped not only by necessity, but by changing expectations about what everyday life might eventually become. At first, these expectations were modest. They did not imagine a world without dirt, but a world in which certain kinds of dirt could be reduced, redirected, or kept at a greater distance from the most sensitive parts of daily life. And in many cases, these expectations began not in grand structures, but in very specific, practical adjustments. One of the most revealing of these adjustments involved water, not just as a tool for cleaning, but as something that needed to be controlled more carefully within the environment itself. In earlier arrangements, water flowed where it could. Rain fell, ran across surfaces, gathered in low points, mixed with whatever it encountered, and either drained away or remained where it settled. Within towns, this often meant that streets became channels not only for movement but for runoff, and that runoff rarely carried only water. Over time, however, the idea that water could be guided began to take on greater importance. Drains, gutters, and channels, simple at first, sometimes uneven or poorly maintained, were introduced or improved in certain places. Their purpose was not purely aesthetic. It was practical. By directing water away from key areas, they could reduce the accumulation of mud, prevent certain forms of stagnation, and limit the spread of waste. But like so many medieval solutions, these systems worked within constraints. A drain might function well during light rain, only to become overwhelmed during heavier weather. It might carry water efficiently in one section of a town, while another section remained uneven and difficult to manage. Maintenance was constant and often inconsistent. A blocked channel could quickly undo the intended effect, returning the area to its previous condition. Still, the principle mattered. The idea that the environment could be shaped, not perfectly but intentionally, began to influence how people thought about space. This influence extended into the house itself. Floors, for instance, began to change in subtle but meaningful ways. While packed earth remained common, especially in more modest homes, the use of wooden boards or stone paving increased in certain contexts. These materials did not eliminate dirt, but they changed its behavior. Mud did not merge with the floor in the same way. Dust could be moved more easily. Spills could be addressed with less permanent effect. The difference was not dramatic in a single moment, but over time it altered the experience of maintaining a space. Sweeping became slightly more effective. The visible results of cleaning became slightly more lasting. And with that came a small shift in expectation. Similarly, the positioning of the hearth continued to evolve. In earlier arrangements, the hearth might sit openly within the room, its smoke rising and dispersing as best it could. But as chimneys became more established, even if imperfectly, the relationship between fire and interior space began to change. Smoke could be directed upward and outward with greater reliability, reducing one of the most constant sources of airborne residue. This did not create a clean interior in the modern sense, but it altered the balance. Surfaces accumulated soot more slowly. air felt marginally clearer. The difference, again, was incremental, but it was perceptible. And perception, in this context, was powerful. Because once people could feel the difference between a room filled with smoke and one where smoke was partially managed, the latter became desirable. It became something to aim for, to maintain, to reproduce where possible. This is how expectations quietly reshape environments. Not through sudden transformation, but through repeated experiences of improvement, however small. Windows, too, played a role in this gradual shift. In many earlier structures, openings for light and air were limited, sometimes covered, sometimes left open depending on weather and security. But as building techniques and materials developed, the ability to control these openings improved. Shutters, and eventually glass in certain contexts, allowed for a more deliberate balance between protection and ventilation. Air could be invited in without exposing the entire interior to the elements. Light could enter without bringing with it the full force of wind and weather. These changes were not universal, but where they occurred, they subtly altered how interiors were experienced. A room that could be aired more easily felt different. It smelled different. It aged differently over the course of a day. And these sensory differences fed back into behavior. People adjusted routines, opened or closed spaces at particular times, responded to changes in weather with greater nuance. The house became not just a shelter, but something closer to a managed environment. Yet even as these developments unfolded, the underlying reality remained. Dirt still entered through movement. It still formed through use. It still persisted in materials that could not be fully cleansed. The improvements did not remove the problem. They redistributed it, softened it, made it more manageable in certain areas while leaving others unchanged. And this unevenness is essential to understanding the medieval experience, because it meant that different parts of the same house could feel very different from one another. A sleeping chamber might seem relatively controlled, while a kitchen remained active and heavy with residue. An upper floor might avoid some of the direct contact with the ground, while the lower level absorbed it constantly. A newly maintained space might contrast sharply with one that had been neglected or overused. These contrasts created a more complex internal landscape. Cleanliness was no longer a single condition, but a spectrum. A household could be both orderly and dirty, depending on where one stood, what one touched, what one noticed. And navigating this spectrum became part of daily awareness. It also began to influence social perception in more nuanced ways. Visitors, for example, did not experience a house all at once. They moved through it, forming impressions based on specific spaces. An entrance that appeared well-kept, a main room that felt relatively fresh, a table that was arranged with care. These elements shaped how the household was judged. Deeper areas, less visible, might tell a different story, but they were not always immediately apparent. This created an incentive to manage certain spaces more carefully than others, to concentrate effort where it would be seen. Again, not because people were indifferent to the rest, but because time and labor were limited and choices had to be made. And these choices, repeated across many households, began to influence the broader environment. Streets, too, reflected this pattern. Areas of high visibility or importance might receive more attention, while others remained more difficult to control. Market spaces, for instance, could be cleared with some regularity, only to become cluttered again as activity resumed. The cycle of use and cleaning continued, but with increasing awareness of its effects. At the same time, certain trades and activities began to be associated with particular locations, sometimes by necessity, sometimes by regulation. Work that produced strong smells, heavy waste, or persistent residue might be pushed toward specific areas, reducing its impact elsewhere. This did not eliminate dirt from those trades, but it changed how it was distributed across the environment. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the idea of organizing space in relation to dirt began to take shape. not as a fully developed system, but as a series of practical decisions made in response to ongoing experience. Where should this activity take place? Where will the waste go? How can this area be kept usable? These questions did not always have perfect answers, but they were being asked more deliberately. And in asking them, medieval people were not escaping dirt, but beginning to engage with it in a different way, less as an unavoidable background condition, and more as something that could be influenced if not fully controlled. Which brings us back, in a quiet and almost circular way, to the individual. Because even as structures changed, and spaces were adjusted, and expectations shifted, the final point of contact between person and environment remained the same. The body still moved through these spaces. It still touched surfaces, wore clothing, handled materials, breathed the air, and carried the marks of its surroundings from one place to another. And so the question becomes not only how the world was changing, but how those changes were experienced at the level of the body itself, how it felt to live within these gradually shifting conditions, and how those sensations, repeated day after day, began to alter what people noticed, what they tolerated, and what they quietly began to hope for next. Because the body was where all of this finally settled. It was where dust gathered on the skin, where smoke lingered in the hair, where the smell of the hearth or the street followed a person long after they had left it behind. It was where the roughness of a floor was felt through thin soles, where dampness seeped into clothing, where heat and cold shaped the rhythm of movement and rest. The environment was not something observed at a distance. It was carried, quite literally, on the body itself. Hands, in particular, tell a quiet story. They were in constant contact with the materials of life: grain, wood, leather, tools, water, animals, ash. They absorbed texture, residue, and scent throughout the day. A person might wash their hands before eating, if water and time allowed, but even then, the act of washing was often brief and practical. It removed the most immediate layer, preparing the hands for the next task, but it did not return them to a neutral state. The next contact began almost immediately, and this repetition shaped expectation. Clean hands were not expected to remain clean for long. They were expected to be usable, to be acceptable within the context of the next activity. The face and hair carried similar traces. Dust from roads settled lightly across the skin. Smoke from fires clung to hair, especially in enclosed spaces. Even in households that made efforts to maintain personal cleanliness, these elements returned with a kind of quiet persistence. A person stepping outside into a dry street might feel the fine grit of dust within moments. A person working near a fire might carry its scent for the rest of the day. Bathing, when it occurred, provided relief but not permanence. The experience of washing the body, whether in a basin, a bathhouse, or a stream, could create a clear sense of difference. The skin felt lighter, the air seemed fresher, the body more at ease. But this state was always temporary. It lasted until the body re-entered the same environment that had shaped it before. And so bathing became less about achieving a lasting condition and more about restoring a moment of balance. Clothing reinforced this cycle in its own way. A freshly changed garment, especially linen worn close to the skin, could create a sense of renewal. It marked a shift, a return to a more ordered state. But outer garments, worn repeatedly, accumulated the marks of use. Dust settled into folds, fibers absorbed oils, and the scent of daily activity became part of the material itself. These garments were not discarded or replaced lightly. They were maintained, repaired, and used again. And with each use, they carried a little more of the environment with them, even as they continued to serve their purpose. The body, then, existed within a kind of moving boundary. It was not separate from dirt, but it was not entirely defined by it either. It could be cleaned, refreshed, made presentable, but always within limits. These limits were understood, even if not always articulated. They shaped how people judged themselves and others, how they recognized effort, and how they responded to difference. Because difference mattered. A person who appeared more carefully maintained, whose linen was cleaner, whose appearance was more orderly, could signal a certain level of control over their environment. This did not mean they were free of dirt, but that they were managing it more effectively, at least in visible ways. And this management became part of social language. Communicated attention, discipline, resources. It suggested that a household was functioning, that routines were being followed, that labor was being applied. In contrast, visible neglect could suggest something else entirely: disorder, poverty, or a breakdown in the systems that kept life stable. But even here, the distinction was never absolute, because everyone, regardless of status, remained within the same broader environment. The difference was often one of degree, of distance, of timing, not of complete separation. And this shared condition created a kind of quiet familiarity. People understood what it meant to carry the day on their bodies. They recognized the signs of work, of travel, of weather. They knew how quickly a clean state could be undone, and how much effort was required to restore it, even briefly. This understanding extended into daily routines in subtle ways. Morning, for instance, was not just a time of waking, but of reassembling the body for the day. Hair might be combed, clothing adjusted, hands and face attended to. These actions did not erase the past entirely, but they created a starting point, a moment of relative order before the day's activity began. Evening, in turn, carried its own rhythm. The body, marked by the day's work, returned to rest. Some level of cleaning might occur, depending on circumstance, but often the emphasis was on transition, moving from activity to stillness, from exposure to a more contained space. And between these points, the body moved continuously through environments that shaped it. A walk through a market might leave traces of dust and scent. Work in a field might cover clothing and skin with soil. Time spent near a hearth might deepen the presence of smoke. Each activity layered upon the last, creating a cumulative effect that could be felt, even if it was not always consciously examined. This layering is important because it reveals how dirt was experienced not as a single event, but as an ongoing process. There was no clear moment when one became dirty in a definitive sense. Instead, there was a gradual accumulation, a shifting state that changed with each movement, each task, each environment. Cleanliness, in turn, was not a fixed condition, but a temporary point within that process. And yet, within this continuous movement, there were moments when the difference became more pronounced. After a long journey, for example, the body might feel distinctly altered, coated with the residue of the road, carrying the weight of distance. Returning to a more controlled environment, even a modest one, could create a strong sense of contrast. The act of washing, of changing clothes, of resting in a familiar space would feel more significant in that context. Similarly, after periods of illness or confinement or unusual conditions, the return to ordinary routines could highlight the body's relationship with its surroundings in new ways. What had once been unnoticed might become more apparent, if only for a time. These moments did not redefine the entire experience, but they punctuated it. They reminded people quietly of the difference between what was usual and what might be possible under slightly different conditions. And as these reminders accumulated, they contributed to the gradual shift in expectation that was already beginning to take shape. Because once the body had experienced even a small improvement, cleaner air, fresher linen, a more controlled space, it became harder to ignore the contrast when those conditions were absent. And this contrast, repeated across different contexts, began to influence not just individual habits, but collective thinking. What if this could be maintained longer? What if this condition could be extended beyond a single room, a single moment, a single household? These questions did not always lead to immediate answers, but they lingered, And in lingering, they began to connect with the practical changes already underway, in building, in water management, in the organization of space, in the regulation of activity. The body, after all, was the point where all of these changes were felt. And as people continued to move through their world, carrying it with them, shaping it, responding to it, the relationship between dirt, environment, and daily life continued to evolve, not through sudden transformation, but through the steady accumulation of small experiences that, taken together, began to suggest that even something as persistent as dirt might, in time, be understood differently, not suddenly, and not everywhere at once, but through a slow tightening of attention around the smallest, most ordinary details, details that had always been present, but were now being noticed with a slightly different kind of patience. One of the most revealing of these details was the surface itself. For much of the medieval period, surfaces were something to be used, endured, and maintained just enough to remain functional. A floor was walked on. A table was worked on. A bench was sat on. Their condition mattered, but only within limits. As long as they served their purpose, the deeper state beneath the visible layer was rarely examined too closely. But as expectations shifted, even slightly, the surface began to take on new meaning. It was no longer only a place where activity happened. It became something to be observed more carefully. How smooth it felt underfoot. How much dust it held after sweeping. How quickly it changed from clean to marked. These were not dramatic questions, but they introduced a new kind of awareness, one that lingered just a little longer than before. And with that awareness came a subtle change in behavior. Sweeping, for instance, was no longer just a routine task. It became a way of measuring change. A freshly swept floor created a visible contrast with what had been there moments before. And when that contrast faded, when footprints reappeared, when dust settled again, it provided a quiet reminder of how quickly the environment returned to its previous state. This cycle was not new, but the attention given to it began to deepen. People started to notice not only that dirt returned, but how it returned. Did it gather first near the doorway? Did it settle more heavily near the hearth? Did certain materials seem to hold onto it more than others? These observations, small as they were, began to form patterns. And patterns, once recognized, suggested the possibility of intervention. If dirt followed certain paths, perhaps those paths could be altered. If certain surfaces held it more stubbornly, perhaps different materials could be used. If certain areas accumulated it more quickly, perhaps those areas required more focused attention. These were not abstract ideas. They emerged from repetition, from the quiet act of doing the same tasks again and again, and noticing, almost without intending to, the way results varied. And once that noticing began, it extended beyond the floor. Tables, for example, became more than just working surfaces. They were places where food was prepared and consumed, where hands came into direct contact with materials that entered the body. The condition of the table, how clean it appeared, how it felt to the touch, began to carry a slightly different weight. Wiping a table was not new, but the attention given to the act, the care taken in certain households, began to reflect a growing sensitivity to the idea that some forms of dirt mattered more in certain contexts. The same could be said for containers. Bowls, cups, storage vessels, all of these objects existed at the intersection of environment and consumption. They held water, food, and other materials that were directly connected to the body. Their cleanliness or lack of it could be felt immediately, and so they, too, became sites of attention. Rinsing, scraping, wiping, these actions were not innovations, but they took on a more deliberate character in some settings. The goal was not perfection, but a clearer separation between what was acceptable and what was not, particularly in relation to what entered the body. This shift, though subtle, marked a kind of quiet boundary forming, not between clean and dirty in a total sense, but between different kinds of dirt and different levels of tolerance. Some forms could be managed, even ignored. Others began to feel less acceptable, less easily dismissed. And this distinction began to influence how people moved through their own spaces. A person might step carefully around a particularly muddy patch near an entrance, not simply out of habit, but with a clearer sense of what that mud represented. They might take more care with certain objects than others, recognizing that contact carried consequences, even if those consequences were not fully understood. This is how awareness deepens, not through sudden revelation, but through the accumulation of small, repeated recognitions. And as it deepened, it began to intersect with broader changes already underway. Urban spaces, for instance, were becoming more densely used in certain regions. More people, more activity, more movement through the same streets and structures. This density did not create dirt, it intensified its presence. It made patterns more visible, more difficult to ignore. A street that had once been manageable with occasional attention might now require more frequent care. A drain that had once functioned adequately might become overwhelmed more often. The accumulation of waste, of runoff, of everyday residue became more noticeable, more pressing. And with that pressure came new responses. Not always effective, not always consistent, but increasingly deliberate. Rules were proposed, enforced, or ignored. Responsibilities were assigned, contested, or neglected. The environment became something that required coordination, not just individual effort. And within this growing complexity, the relationship between people and dirt continued to shift. Because dirt, once seen primarily as an unavoidable aspect of life, was beginning very slowly to be seen as something that could be organized, managed, perhaps even reduced in certain contexts. Not eliminated, not conquered, but influenced. And that distinction mattered. It marked the beginning of a different kind of engagement. One that did not accept the environment entirely as it was, but also did not imagine it could be completely transformed. Instead, it operated in a middle space. A space where effort could make a difference, even if that difference was temporary. A space where small improvements could be valued, even if they did not solve the larger problem. A space where the experience of living, of walking, touching, breathing, resting, could be shaped, however slightly, by the choices people made within the limits they faced. And it is within that space that something else begins to emerge, almost quietly. A growing sense that the environment, though persistent and often resistant, was not entirely fixed, that it could be adjusted, improved, made more tolerable in ways that accumulated over time. And once that sense takes hold, even in a limited form, it begins to influence not just what people do, but how they think about what might come next. Because if dirt could be guided along certain paths, if surfaces could be made easier to maintain, if air could be moved, water directed, waste managed just a little more effectively, then perhaps the world itself, in its smallest details, was not as immovable as it had once seemed. And that quiet possibility, held within the most ordinary acts of daily life, began to move outward, touching not just the house or the street, but the broader ways in which medieval society would, slowly and unevenly, begin to reshape the environments it depended on. But what makes this shift especially interesting is that it did not begin with large, visible transformations. It began with friction, small moments where the ordinary experience of dirt became just uncomfortable enough, just inconvenient enough, to invite a slightly different response. A doorway that stayed muddy longer than expected. A room that felt unusually close after several days of damp weather. A street that became difficult to pass not just once, but repeatedly, in ways that interrupted daily routines. These were not extraordinary events. They were familiar, but familiarity, when repeated often enough, can begin to feel like pressure. And pressure, even in quiet forms, can change behavior. Take the example of repeated movement through a single space. When a path becomes consistently difficult, too muddy, too uneven, too cluttered, people begin to adjust. They step differently. They choose alternate routes. They lay down temporary materials, boards, straw, stones, to make passage easier. At first, these solutions are immediate and local. A plank placed across a particularly wet section of ground. A scattering of straw to absorb moisture. A stone positioned where footing is most uncertain. Each act is small, practical, and temporary. But over time, these temporary solutions begin to accumulate. A path that is repeatedly reinforced starts to resemble something more stable. A doorway that is consistently managed becomes easier to maintain. A habit forms not because someone has declared a rule, but because the pattern proves useful. And once a pattern proves useful, it tends to persist. This is one of the quieter mechanisms through which medieval environments began to change. Not through grand planning, but through repetition that gradually hardened into structure. The same process can be seen in the management of interior spaces. If a certain area of the floor is always the first to collect dirt, it may receive more attention. If a particular arrangement of furniture makes cleaning easier, it may be maintained. If a certain storage method reduces spillage or disorder, it may become standard within a household. None of these decisions transform the entire environment, but they shape it. They create micro-adjustments, small improvements that, taken together, begin to alter the experience of daily life. And importantly, these changes are not always conscious in a formal sense. People do not necessarily articulate them as innovations. They simply notice what works and continue doing it. Over time, these practices spread, not through instruction, but through observation and imitation. A neighbor sees a more stable entrance and adopts a similar approach. A household notices that a particular arrangement reduces clutter and repeats it. A craftsman develops a slightly different method that produces less waste or easier cleanup, and others begin to follow. This is how change often moves in environments without centralized control, through quiet transmission, through example rather than command. And as these practices spread, they begin to interact with one another. A more stable floor works better with regular sweeping. Better drainage supports cleaner thresholds. Improved storage reduces the movement of loose materials through the house. Each adjustment reinforces the others, creating a network of small improvements that collectively shift the balance, even if no single change appears decisive on its own. But there is also a limit to this process. Because each improvement exists within the same broader constraints: materials, labor, climate, and the fundamental structure of medieval life. A well-maintained path can still be undone by heavy rain. A carefully cleaned room can still accumulate dust from the air. A well-organized household can still be affected by the conditions outside its walls. And this is where the tension remains. On one side, there is growing awareness, increasing attention, and a series of practical adjustments that make life more manageable. On the other, there is a persistent environment that continues to generate dirt through every ordinary activity. The two do not cancel each other out. They coexist. And living within that coexistence required a kind of balance that was both practical and psychological. People learned to recognize improvement without expecting permanence. They learned to value effort without demanding complete success. They learned, in a sense, to live within a system that could be shaped but not fully controlled. And yet, even within that balance, certain moments stand out, moments when the limits of the system became more visible than usual. A period of prolonged rain, for example, could push the environment beyond its usual capacity to recover. Paths became impassable, interiors damp, materials slow to dry. The ordinary routines of maintenance became more difficult, less effective. The difference between a managed environment and an overwhelmed one became sharply clear. Similarly, times of increased activity, market days, seasonal labor, gatherings, could intensify the flow of people and materials through a space, accelerating the accumulation of dirt in ways that exceeded normal patterns. In these moments, the question of control became more urgent, not in an abstract sense, but in a practical one. How can this space remain usable? How can movement continue? How can daily life proceed without being constantly interrupted? These are the kinds of questions that begin to shift attention outward, beyond the individual household, because the answer increasingly cannot be found within a single space. It requires coordination. It requires shared effort. It requires some level of agreement about how the environment is to be managed across a wider area. And this is where the story begins to extend more clearly into the collective realm, not as a fully organized system, but as a series of responses that acknowledge a simple reality: that dirt, once it reaches a certain scale, cannot be managed alone. A single household can sweep its floor, but it cannot control the condition of the street. A family can maintain its doorway, but it cannot prevent what arrives from outside. The environment is shared, and so the problem is shared. And once that becomes unavoidable, the solutions begin to shift in character. They become less about individual effort and more about collective patterns, rules, expectations, responsibilities that extend beyond the walls of a single home. These patterns are not always stable. They are negotiated, contested, sometimes ignored, but they represent a different kind of response, one that recognizes that the persistence of dirt is not just a matter of daily habit, but of how an entire community organizes the spaces it inhabits. And it is within this growing awareness, this gradual movement from individual management to shared responsibility, that the medieval world begins to edge towards something new. Not a clean world, not even a consistently cleaner one, but a world in which the question of how to live with dirt is no longer asked in isolation. A world in which the smallest details of daily life, footsteps, surfaces, water, air, are increasingly understood as part of a larger system, one that can be influenced, adjusted, and, at times, briefly brought into a kind of fragile order before the next cycle begins. And it is that cycle, the quiet repetition of effort, interruption, and renewal, that begins to draw clearer lines through the medieval world, not as firm boundaries, but as tendencies that people start to recognize and, in small ways, respond to more deliberately. Because once dirt is understood as something that moves through shared space, the question naturally follows: who is responsible for that movement? At first, the answer remains diffuse. Responsibility is informal, tied to proximity, habit, and immediate need. A person clears what is in front of them. A household manages its own threshold. A craftsman deals with the residue of his work. These actions are local, reactive, and often sufficient in quieter moments. But as environments become more active, more crowded, more interconnected, the limits of this informal system begin to show. A street used by many cannot be maintained by one. A drain that serves several households requires attention that extends beyond any single door. A buildup of waste in one area affects those who did not create it. These situations do not introduce new problems. They reveal existing ones more clearly, and in revealing them, they begin to change how people think about space. A street is no longer just a place one passes through. It becomes something that must be kept passable. A shared area subject to the actions of many, requiring some level of agreement about how it is treated. This does not mean that agreement is easily reached. On the contrary, it often emerges unevenly, through tension as much as cooperation. One household may take care, while another neglects. One area may be maintained, while another falls into disorder. Expectations form, but they are not always met. And yet, over time, these tensions can lead to patterns. Certain behaviors become expected, even if not always enforced. Certain responsibilities are recognized, even if unevenly fulfilled. A sense develops, again, not universal, not perfectly stable, that shared space carries shared consequences. This sense begins to influence how people act, even in small ways. A person might think twice before discarding waste in a particular place, not out of abstract principle, but because of how it will affect movement, smell, or access. A group might organize the clearing of a path, not as a formal project, but as a practical response to a recurring problem. These actions are modest, but they mark a shift. They move the management of dirt from the purely individual into the realm of the collective, even if that collective remains loosely defined. And within this shift, another layer begins to appear, one tied not just to responsibility but to authority. Because once a problem is recognized as shared, it raises the question of who has the right or the obligation to direct how it is addressed. In some cases, this takes the form of simple agreements between neighbors. In others, it begins to connect with larger structures, local leaders, guilds, or governing bodies that attempt, with varying degrees of success, to establish rules or expectations. These rules might address where waste can be placed, how often certain areas should be cleared, or what activities are permitted in particular spaces. They are not always detailed, and they are not always followed. But their existence reflects a growing recognition that the environment cannot be left entirely to chance. And yet, even as these structures develop, they remain constrained by the same realities that shaped earlier practices. Enforcement is uneven. Resources are limited. Conditions change with weather, season, and activity. A rule may exist, but its effect depends on whether it is observed, whether it can be applied, whether it aligns with the daily needs of those it affects. And so the system that emerges is not one of strict control, but of ongoing negotiation. People adapt, respond, resist, comply, or ignore, depending on circumstance. The environment reflects these interactions, shifting not only with physical conditions, but with social ones. A well-maintained street may become less so if attention lapses. A neglected area may improve if effort is concentrated. Nothing remains fixed for long. And within this constant adjustment, the presence of dirt continues to act as a kind of indicator, a visible, tangible sign of how well or poorly a system is functioning at any given moment. A buildup suggests imbalance. A cleared space suggests effort. Neither state is permanent, but both are meaningful. And people learn to read these signs, often without conscious reflection. They notice where movement is easy, where it is difficult, where the air feels heavy, where it feels clearer. They adjust their routes, their routines, their expectations accordingly. This awareness, subtle as it is, shapes behavior across entire communities. It influences where people gather, where they avoid, where they invest effort, and where they accept limitation. And in doing so, it reinforces the idea that the environment is not static, but responsive, affected by the cumulative actions of those who inhabit it. At the same time, this responsiveness introduces a new kind of unpredictability. Because if the environment can change based on collective behavior, it can also change when that behavior shifts. A busy period may overwhelm existing practices. A lapse in attention may allow problems to grow. A change in population, activity, or weather may alter patterns that once seemed stable. And each of these changes requires a response. Sometimes that response is immediate and practical. At other times, it is slower, emerging through trial and error, through repeated attempts to find a workable balance. And through all of this, the central condition remains. Dirt is still present. It still moves, accumulates, returns. But the way people engage with it is becoming more layered, more structured, more aware of the connections between individual actions and collective outcomes. This does not make the environment clean. It makes it negotiated. And that distinction matters, because a negotiated environment is one in which expectations can evolve, where practices can be refined, where small improvements can be sustained long enough to become habits. and where habits, over time, can begin to resemble something more enduring. Not a solution, not a final state, but a different way of living within the same constraints. And as these negotiated patterns continue to develop, they begin to intersect with other forces, economic, social, and material, that further shape how space is used, how resources are allocated, and how the everyday presence of dirt is managed within a world that is slowly, almost imperceptibly, learning to see itself as something that can be organized, not just endured. It is at this intersection between habit and structure, between individual effort and collective expectation, that the next phase of this story begins to take shape, carried forward not by a single decision, but by the accumulation of many small ones, each leaving its trace in the spaces people continue to move through day after day. And as those traces accumulate, something else begins to emerge, something less visible than a swept floor or a cleared path, but perhaps more significant in the long run, a growing sense of expectation. Not expectation in the modern sense of entitlement to comfort or control, but a quieter, more practical awareness that certain conditions could be improved, and that improvement, once experienced, could be maintained, at least for a time, if effort was applied in the right way. This awareness does not appear suddenly. It develops through repetition. A street that has been cleared once can be cleared again. A drain that has been repaired can function again. A room that has been aired and arranged can feel that way again, even if only briefly. Each of these experiences leaves behind more than the immediate result. It leaves behind a memory of possibility. And memory, even in small forms, has a way of shaping behavior. Because once a person has experienced a space that feels easier to move through, or cleaner to inhabit, or less burdened by the immediate presence of dirt, that experience becomes a reference point. It becomes something against which other conditions are quietly compared. This does not mean dissatisfaction in a dramatic sense. Medieval life does not suddenly become defined by a desire for constant improvement. But it does mean that the baseline begins to shift, almost imperceptibly. What was once accepted without question may begin to feel less acceptable in certain contexts. What was once ignored may begin to draw attention. And what was once seen as inevitable may begin to be seen as something that could, under the right conditions, be handled differently. This shift is subtle, but it has consequences, because it changes how effort is directed. Instead of simply reacting to dirt as it appears, people begin, in small ways, to anticipate it. They notice where it tends to gather, where it tends to return, where it tends to resist removal. And with that noticing comes the possibility of acting earlier, or more strategically. A doorway might be reinforced before it becomes unusable. A surface might be maintained more regularly to prevent deeper accumulation. A shared space might be addressed before it reaches a point of disruption. These are not large-scale interventions. They are adjustments in timing, in attention, in the rhythm of daily activity. But over time, they begin to alter the experience of the environment. Because dirt that is managed earlier behaves differently from dirt that is allowed to accumulate. It is less entrenched, less disruptive, more easily moved. And this creates a kind of feedback. Effort applied at the right moment produces a more noticeable result. A more noticeable result encourages the continuation of that effort. And gradually a pattern forms. This pattern does not eliminate the underlying cycle, but it modifies it. The rise and fall of cleanliness becomes less extreme, more moderated, shaped by the timing and consistency of intervention. And as this pattern takes hold in certain places, it begins to influence expectations more broadly. People come to recognize that some environments are easier to maintain than others, not simply because of their inherent qualities, but because of how they are managed. This recognition introduces a new dimension to the way space is understood. It is no longer only about what a place is, but about what is done within it. A well-kept street is not just a feature of its location or material, but of the practices that sustain it. A more orderly household reflects not just the structure of the building, but the routines that shape its use. And this emphasis on practice begins to intersect with other aspects of medieval life in interesting ways. Work, for instance, is not only a source of dirt, but also a means of managing it. The same hands that produce residue are the ones that remove it. The same spaces that generate disorder are the ones that are restored. This creates a continuous loop in which production and maintenance are intertwined, each dependent on the other. And within that loop, skill begins to matter. Not in a formal, recognized sense, but in a practical one. Some people become better at managing certain tasks. They learn how to sweep more effectively, how to arrange materials to reduce spillage, how to maintain surfaces in ways that prolong their usability. These skills are rarely named as such, but they are recognized in practice. A well-managed space reflects not only effort, but experience. An experience once gained can be shared, not through instruction in the modern sense, but through observation. A neighbor notices a more effective method and adopts it. A household member learns by watching another. A practice spreads not because it is declared superior, but because it proves itself useful over time. This quiet transmission of knowledge adds another layer to the evolving relationship with dirt, because it means that improvement is not only possible but transferable. What works in one place can, with adjustment, work in another. And as these practices spread, they begin to create a kind of informal standard, not uniform, not enforced, but present enough to influence behavior. Certain ways of managing space begin to feel more appropriate, more effective, more aligned with the growing sense of what is possible. And this, in turn, feeds back into expectation. Because once a practice becomes familiar, its absence becomes more noticeable. A space that is not maintained in this way may feel more difficult, more burdensome, not because it has changed, but because the point of comparison has. This is how gradual change often unfolds, not by replacing one system with another, but by shifting the context in which the existing system is experienced. And within that shifting context, even the most persistent elements, like dirt, begin to be understood differently. Not as a fixed condition, but as something that responds, however imperfectly, to human action. Something that can be shaped, redirected, moderated, and perhaps, in certain places, reduced to a degree that would have seemed unlikely before. But even as this possibility takes shape, it remains bounded. The broader environment continues to exert its influence. Weather still disrupts. Materials still wear. Activities still produce residue. The cycle continues. And yet, within that continuity, the experience of living with dirt is no longer exactly the same as it was. It has been altered, not erased, not transformed beyond recognition, but adjusted through countless small acts of attention and effort. And as those acts continue, repeating across households, streets, and communities, they begin to form patterns that extend beyond individual experience. Patterns that connect people through shared practices, shared expectations, and a shared understanding that the environment they inhabit, while persistent and often resistant, is not entirely beyond their influence. And it is within those patterns, quiet, uneven, but enduring, that the next developments begin to take shape, not as sudden breakthroughs, but as extensions of the same process that has been unfolding all along, carried forward by the simple, repeated question of how to live, as comfortably as possible, within a world that never fully stops making dirt. And yet, as that question is repeated quietly, daily, almost without reflection, it begins to shift in tone. It becomes less about enduring what cannot be changed, and more about identifying what can be adjusted, even slightly, even temporarily, in ways that make life feel just a little more manageable. One of the first places this shift becomes more visible is in how time itself is used. Earlier, the management of dirt often followed the immediate needs of the moment. Something became too inconvenient, and it was addressed. A space became unusable, and it was cleared. The rhythm was reactive, shaped by disruption. But as awareness deepens, that rhythm begins to change. Tasks start to move forward in time, occurring before conditions become overwhelming. A floor is swept not only when it is visibly dirty, but because it will become so if left unattended. A surface is wiped not just after use, but in anticipation of the next use. A space is arranged with tomorrow in mind, not just the present moment. These are small changes in timing, but they alter the experience of living within the environment. Because dirt that is addressed earlier feels different from dirt that has already taken hold. It is lighter, less embedded, more responsive to effort. And this responsiveness reinforces the sense that action, applied at the right moment, can have a meaningful effect. This creates a new kind of rhythm, one that is less about interruption and more about maintenance. Maintenance, in this context, is not a formal system. It is a pattern of attention, a way of distributing effort across time to prevent conditions from reaching their most difficult state. And once this pattern becomes established, even in a limited form, it begins to influence other aspects of daily life. Work is arranged around it. Movement adapts to it. Spaces are used in ways that support it. A person might avoid stepping across a freshly cleaned area, not because it is forbidden, but because the effort that created that state is understood and valued. A household might delay a particular task until conditions are more favorable for managing its effects. These decisions are small, often unspoken, but they reflect a growing sensitivity to the relationship between action and environment. And this sensitivity extends outward. Because when multiple households begin to operate with a similar awareness, even if only loosely aligned, the collective environment begins to reflect it. A street that is maintained more regularly does not reach the same level of disruption as before. A shared space that receives attention at consistent intervals remains more usable over time. Again, the difference is not absolute. The environment does not become clean in any modern sense, but it becomes more stable, more predictable in its fluctuations. And predictability in this context is valuable. It allows people to plan, to anticipate, to move through their world with a slightly greater sense of control. This sense of control, however limited, has its own effect. It changes how people relate to their surroundings. Instead of reacting only to what is immediately present, they begin to think in terms of patterns, how conditions develop, how they can be influenced, how they might be prevented from becoming more difficult. And this way of thinking begins to intersect with other forms of organization. Markets, for example, operate on schedules. Work follows seasonal rhythms. Religious practices mark time in structured ways. As these rhythms become more pronounced, they begin to align in subtle ways with the management of space. Cleaning before a gathering, clearing a path before a market day, preparing a space in advance of a known event. These actions are not entirely new, but they take on greater significance as part of a broader pattern of anticipation. And anticipation, in turn, reinforces the idea that the environment can be shaped through timing, not just effort. But even as these patterns develop, they remain vulnerable, because the environment still operates according to forces that cannot be fully predicted or controlled. A sudden change in weather can disrupt even the most carefully maintained routine. An unexpected increase in activity can overwhelm existing practices. A lapse in attention, even a brief one, can allow conditions to shift more quickly than expected. And when these disruptions occur, they reveal the limits of the system. They remind people that while the environment can be influenced, it cannot be fully stabilized. This reminder does not undo the progress that has been made, but it tempers it. It keeps expectations grounded, preventing the gradual improvements from being mistaken for complete transformation. And within this balance between growing control and persistent limitation, the medieval relationship with dirt continues to evolve. Not in a straight line, but in a series of adjustments, each building on the last, each shaped by the conditions in which it occurs. And as these adjustments accumulate, they begin to affect not just how spaces are maintained, but how they are imagined. Because once people begin to think of their environment as something that can be managed over time, they also begin to imagine what it might look like if that management were extended further. What if a street could remain passable for longer periods? What if a room could stay fresher throughout the day? What if certain forms of dirt could be kept at a greater distance from daily life? These questions do not lead immediately to solutions, but they create a direction, a way of thinking that looks beyond the immediate cycle and considers the possibility of longer-lasting change. And it is within that direction that new ideas begin to take root, often quietly, often without clear definition, but with enough presence to influence the decisions that follow. Because once the environment is seen not just as something to endure, but as something to work with, even in small ways, it opens the possibility of further adjustment, further refinement, further effort applied with slightly different expectations. And as that possibility continues to unfold, carried forward by the same daily actions that have always shaped the medieval world, it begins to intersect with emerging changes in materials, in building practices, in the organization of labor, changes that, when combined with this growing awareness, will begin to alter the landscape in ways that are not immediately dramatic, but that, over time, will become increasingly difficult to ignore. At first, these changes appear almost incidental, small. Refinements in how materials are chosen, how structures are assembled, how space is divided and used. But when viewed within the longer rhythm that has been unfolding, they begin to take on a different significance. Because they do not arrive in isolation. They arrive into a world that has already begun to notice, to anticipate, to manage. And that means their effects are not simply added to existing conditions, they interact with them. Take, for example, the gradual improvement in how surfaces are finished. A roughly packed earth floor behaves very differently from a more carefully laid wooden one, or a surface of fitted stone. The difference is not only in appearance, but in how dirt moves across it, how easily it can be gathered, how deeply it can settle. A smoother surface does not prevent dirt from arriving, but it changes the nature of its presence. Dust can be pushed rather than absorbed. Mud can be removed rather than merged. Spills can be contained rather than diffused. These are small distinctions, but they accumulate in experience. A person sweeping such a floor notices that the result holds a little longer. The effort produces a clearer outcome, and that clarity reinforces the growing expectation that certain conditions can be maintained, at least for a time. The same principle extends upward, into the structure of walls and ceilings. As materials are worked more carefully, plaster applied more evenly, timber joined more tightly, the number of surfaces that trap and hold dirt in irregular ways begins to decrease. Cracks and gaps do not disappear, but in some cases they become less dominant. This changes the behavior of air within a room. Dust does not settle in quite the same way. Smoke does not linger in quite the same patterns. Again, the difference is not transformative in a single moment, but perceptible over time. And perception, once established, has a way of guiding further change. Because once a space feels slightly easier to maintain, the effort to maintain it becomes more worthwhile. The relationship between labor and result becomes more balanced. And when that balance shifts even slightly, it encourages continuity. People continue doing what works. They invest effort where it produces visible improvement. They begin, often without formal planning, to shape their environment in ways that support that effort. This is how material change and behavioral change begin to reinforce one another. A better surface invites more consistent maintenance. More consistent maintenance preserves the benefit of the better surface. And together they create a feedback loop, small but persistent. This loop does not extend evenly across all spaces. Some areas remain resistant. The yard, for instance, continues to be shaped by weather, animals, and movement in ways that resist lasting control. Mud returns with rain, dust with dryness, organic matter with daily activity. Improvements here are more difficult to sustain, more vulnerable to disruption. And yet, even in these areas, small adjustments appear. Paths are marked, reinforced, revisited. Certain routes become preferred, not because they are perfect, but because they are less difficult. These routes begin to define movement more clearly, reducing the spread of dirt into less used areas. And as movement becomes more structured, so too does the distribution of dirt. It gathers more predictably, can be addressed more directly. The environment begins to show patterns that are not only the result of natural conditions, but of repeated human decisions. And this is where the relationship between dirt and design becomes more apparent. Not design in the formal sense of planned architecture, but in the gradual shaping of space through use. A doorway that is slightly raised reduces the immediate flow of water and mud. A threshold that is reinforced becomes easier to keep clear. A separation between spaces, however modest, limits the movement of certain materials from one area to another. Each of these adjustments is small, but together they begin to alter the internal logic of the environment. They create zones. Not clean zones and dirty zones in an absolute sense, but areas where certain kinds of dirt are more likely and others less so. This zoning is never perfect, but it introduces a new level of organization. A place for work that produces residue. A place for rest that is relatively protected. A place for storage that is kept as stable as possible. These distinctions have always existed to some degree, but they become more defined as awareness and materials allow. And as they become more defined, they begin to influence behavior more strongly. People move differently through a space that has clearer boundaries. They adjust their actions based on where they are. They become more attentive to transitions between inside and outside, between work and rest, between areas of higher and lower accumulation. These transitions, once blurred, begin to carry more meaning. A step across a threshold is not just a change in location, but a change in expectation. A shift in how one moves, what one carries, how one behaves. And as these expectations become more consistent, they begin to shape the environment in return. Because behavior that aligns with space reinforces the structure of that space. And structure that is reinforced becomes more stable over time. This stability, however partial, has its own effect. It allows certain areas to maintain a condition that is slightly removed from the full intensity of the surrounding environment. Not isolated, not untouched, but moderated. And within these moderated spaces, new possibilities begin to appear. A room that stays relatively stable over the course of a day allows for different uses. Objects can be placed with greater confidence that they will remain in a usable state. Activities that require a certain level of order become more practical. This does not eliminate the presence of dirt, but it changes its impact. It becomes something that is managed within a defined range, rather than something that constantly overwhelms. And this change, subtle as it is, begins to influence not just how people act, but what they attempt. Because when conditions are slightly more stable, the range of possible actions expands. Tasks that would have been difficult in a more chaotic environment become feasible. Routines can be maintained with greater consistency. And consistency, once established, creates its own form of reliability. This reliability does not extend everywhere. It is fragile, dependent on continued effort, on favorable conditions, on the absence of disruption. But it is enough to be noticed. enough to be valued. And once valued, it becomes something people seek to preserve. This desire to preserve, to hold onto a more manageable state for longer periods, begins to influence decisions in ways that are not always immediately visible. Materials are chosen with care, not only for their immediate function, but for how they behave over time. Spaces are arranged with an eye toward maintaining their condition. Effort is directed not just at solving problems as they arise, but at preventing them from becoming more difficult. And as these tendencies continue, they begin to intersect with broader developments, trade bringing new materials, techniques spreading between regions, knowledge accumulating through repeated practice. These intersections do not produce immediate transformation, but they create a kind of momentum, a gradual, uneven movement toward environments that are slightly more controlled, slightly more responsive to human intention. And within that movement, the presence of dirt remains constant, but its role begins to shift, from something that defines the limits of daily life to something that exists within those limits, shaped and reshaped by the same quiet, persistent efforts that have been guiding the medieval world all along. And it is in that shifting role, still present, still persistent, but increasingly understood as something that can be worked with, that the next layer of change begins to gather, waiting to emerge through the same small decisions that continue to shape the spaces people inhabit. Because what begins to change next is not simply the environment itself, but the scale at which people think about it. Up to this point, most adjustments have been local, focused on the room, the threshold, the yard, the street immediately outside. Even when shared effort appears, it tends to remain close to the places people move through daily, shaped by what can be seen, felt, and managed directly. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, attention begins to extend beyond those immediate boundaries. Not because people suddenly become more ambitious, but because certain problems refuse to stay contained. Water, for example, does not respect the limits of a single household. A blocked drain upstream affects the flow downstream. Waste discarded at one point travels, carried by rain or runoff, into areas that did not produce it. Mud formed in one section of a path is spread by every footstep that passes through it. In each case, the source and the effect are separated. And that separation introduces a new kind of awareness. It suggests that the environment is not just a collection of individual spaces, but a connected system, one in which actions in one place can shape conditions in another. This idea is not always expressed directly, but it begins to influence behavior in subtle ways. People start to notice patterns that extend beyond their immediate surroundings. They observe how water moves across a broader area. They recognize that certain problems return, not because of what they themselves have done, but because of what is happening elsewhere. And once that recognition takes hold, even partially, it changes how responsibility is understood. Because if the problem is shared across space, then the response, at least in part, must also be shared. This does not lead immediately to coordinated systems, but it does create a kind of tension between what an individual can control and what lies beyond that control. A household may maintain its own space carefully, only to have that effort undone by conditions outside its influence. A street may be cleared, only to be affected by runoff from an adjoining area. These experiences do not erase the value of local effort, but they highlight its limits. And in highlighting those limits, they begin to push attention outward, toward larger patterns, toward connections between spaces, toward the idea that managing dirt is not only a matter of individual habit, but of how an entire environment is organized. This is where the relationship between dirt and structure becomes more visible at a broader level. Not just within the house or even within a single street, but across clusters of activity, neighborhoods, market areas, routes of travel. Movement, once again, plays a central role, because movement is what carries dirt beyond its point of origin. And as movement becomes more regular, more concentrated along certain paths, those paths begin to define the flow of the environment. A well-used route does not just connect places, it shapes them. It gathers residue, distributes it, reinforces certain patterns while weakening others. And over time, these routes become more than simple lines of passage. They become channels, predictable paths along which both people and the byproducts of their activity travel. This predictability, while imperfect, creates new possibilities. If dirt tends to move along certain routes, then those routes can be addressed more deliberately. They can be reinforced, cleared, or maintained in ways that influence the broader environment. Again, the changes are small at first. A path that is more consistently kept. A section that receives more attention than others. But these small differences begin to matter, because they affect how people move. And how people move affects how dirt spreads. A slightly cleaner path encourages more consistent use. More consistent use reinforces the path. And the cycle continues, gradually stabilizing certain areas while leaving others more variable. This uneven stabilization creates contrast. Some spaces become more manageable, more predictable. Others remain difficult, subject to greater fluctuation. And this contrast, once visible, begins to shape expectation. People notice where movement is easier. They prefer routes that are less disruptive. They adjust their behavior in response to the environment as it evolves. And in doing so, they contribute to that evolution. Because preference reinforces pattern. What is used more becomes more defined. What is avoided remains less controlled. And over time, this process begins to organize space in a more structured way. Not through formal design, but through repeated interaction. This is how a loosely connected environment begins, slowly, to take on the qualities of a system. A system that is not planned in its entirety, but that emerges from the accumulation of many small decisions, each shaped by the same underlying question of how to live with dirt in a way that does not constantly disrupt daily life. And as this system becomes more apparent, it begins to intersect with other forces. Trade routes, for example, bring not only goods but movement, people, animals, materials passing through spaces with increasing regularity. Market areas concentrate activity, intensifying the flow of both goods and residue. Workshops cluster, creating localized patterns of production and accumulation. Each of these concentrations adds complexity to the environment. They introduce new sources of dirt, new patterns of movement, new challenges for management. But they also create opportunities. Because where activity is concentrated, so too is attention. A market that becomes too difficult to navigate cannot function effectively. A route that becomes consistently impassable disrupts the flow of goods and people. These pressures do not necessarily lead to immediate solutions, but they create a clear incentive to address certain problems more consistently. And where that incentive exists, effort tends to follow. Not perfectly, not uniformly, but enough to produce noticeable effects. Certain areas receive more sustained attention. Certain practices become more established. And within those areas, the environment begins to reflect a higher degree of organization. Again, not cleanliness in the modern sense, but a form of managed stability, conditions that, while still subject to change, are less prone to sudden disruption. And as these pockets of stability appear, they begin to influence perception more broadly. They demonstrate, in practical terms, that the environment can be shaped beyond the immediate, that patterns can extend across larger spaces, that effort, when applied collectively or consistently, can produce results that last longer than a single moment. This demonstration matters, because it reinforces the growing sense that dirt, while persistent, is not entirely beyond influence, that its movement can be guided, that its accumulation can be moderated, that its impact can be reduced, at least in certain places, for certain periods. And once that sense takes hold, Even in a limited way, it begins to change not only what people do but what they imagine. Because if a street can be kept more passable, if a market space can be maintained well enough to function regularly, if a route can remain usable across changing conditions, then perhaps the environment as a whole is not fixed in the way it once seemed. Perhaps it can be shaped not completely but progressively. And it is within that possibility, still fragile, still uneven, but increasingly visible, that the next set of changes begins to form, driven not by a single innovation, but by the continued interaction between human intention and a world that, while never fully yielding, begins in small ways to respond. And it is that sense of response, subtle, inconsistent, but real, that slowly reshapes how medieval people relate not just to dirt, but to the very idea of their surroundings. Because once the environment begins to feel even slightly responsive, it invites a different kind of attention. Not just noticing what is, but watching for what changes. A place that was once always muddy, now sometimes firm. A room that once always felt close, now occasionally fresh. A surface that once held dirt stubbornly, now easier to clear. These differences are not dramatic, but they are enough to be felt. And once felt, they begin to matter. They create a quiet form of comparison, not between medieval life and some imagined future, but between different moments within the same world. Yesterday and today, before and after, maintained and neglected. This comparison does something important. It introduces variation. And variation, once recognized, becomes something people respond to. They begin to prefer certain conditions over others. They gravitate towards spaces that feel more manageable, more predictable. They avoid, when possible, those that remain difficult, unstable, or overwhelming. This movement toward and away begins to shape the environment in return. Because preference is not passive. It directs use, and use reinforces structure. A space that is used more frequently receives more attention, whether consciously or not. It is walked, cleared, adjusted, maintained. A space that is avoided receives less of that attention. It remains subject to the full force of the surrounding conditions. And so, over time, the environment begins to differentiate itself more clearly. Not through design alone, but through repeated patterns of behavior. Some areas become more stable, more consistently maintained. Others remain more variable, more exposed. And this differentiation creates a kind of landscape within the medieval world, one defined not just by physical structures, but by levels of control, attention, and use. It is within this landscape that the experience of dirt becomes more nuanced. Because dirt is no longer felt in the same way everywhere. In one space, it may be light, manageable, easily addressed. In another, it may be heavy, persistent, more difficult to control. And people learn to navigate this difference. They adjust their expectations based on where they are. They move differently, act differently, even think differently, depending on the level of stability around them. This adaptability becomes a quiet skill. Not something formally taught, but learned through experience. Through the repeated act of moving through environments that are similar, but not identical. And as this skill develops, it begins to influence how people interact with the broader systems of their world. Because once variation is recognized, it raises a new question. Why does one place behave differently from another? Why does this street remain more passable? Why does that room stay fresher for longer? Why does this surface hold less residue? These questions are not always asked in explicit terms, but they are felt. And in being felt, they guide attention. People begin to look more closely at the conditions that produce difference. The materials used, the way water flows, the amount of movement, the presence or absence of certain practices. And through this observation, patterns begin to emerge. Not fully understood, not formally explained, but present enough to influence behavior. If a certain arrangement produces a better result, it is repeated. If a certain condition leads to difficulty, it is avoided or adjusted. And over time, these patterns begin to spread. Not uniformly, not quickly, but steadily, because they are tied to experience, to what works, even if only slightly better than before. And this is how knowledge moves in this context. Not through abstract theory, but through practical recognition. Through the accumulation of small insights, each grounded in the lived reality of managing a persistent environment. And as these insights accumulate, they begin to intersect with another powerful force: time. Not just the time of a single day or a single season, but time across generations. Practices that prove useful are repeated, refined, passed on. Structures that support those practices are maintained, improved, rebuilt. Materials that behave in certain ways are chosen again, when possible. And gradually, the environment begins to carry the imprint of these repeated decisions. Not as a complete transformation, but as a layering. Each generation adding small adjustments to what came before. Each adjustment shaped by the same underlying conditions, but guided by slightly different expectations. And within this layering, the relationship with dirt continues to shift. Because what was once accepted without question is now understood in context. What was once endured becomes something that can be moderated. What was once constant becomes something that varies. And variation, once established, opens the door to further change. But this process is never smooth. It is interrupted, redirected, sometimes reversed. A period of neglect can undo previous improvements. A change in conditions can alter patterns that once seemed stable. New challenges can emerge, requiring new responses. And through all of this, the environment remains active, dynamic, resistant to complete control. Which means that the relationship between people and dirt remains, at its core, a negotiation. Not a problem to be solved once, but a condition to be managed continuously. And yet, even within that ongoing negotiation, something has changed. The sense of possibility has expanded. Not dramatically, not in a way that transforms daily life overnight, but enough to influence how people think about what might be achievable. Enough to encourage continued effort. Enough to sustain the small, repeated actions that, over time, begin to reshape the spaces in which life unfolds. And it is in the persistence of those actions, in the quiet, daily work of sweeping, clearing, arranging, adjusting, that the next stage of this story continues to take form, carried forward not by a single moment of change, but by the steady accumulation of many, each one leaving its mark on a world that, while never fully clean, is no longer experienced in quite the same way as before. And in that subtle shift, almost easy to miss, the medieval world reveals something deeper than the simple idea that people once lived in dirt. Because they did not simply live in it. They worked against it, quietly, constantly, often without recognition, and almost always without the expectation of complete success. What we have been tracing is not a failure of cleanliness, but a different relationship with it. A relationship shaped by materials that could not be sealed, by water that had to be carried, by fire that warmed and blackened at the same time, by animals that fed and fouled, by streets that connected and contaminated, and by homes that could only ever partially separate themselves from the world outside. In that world, dirt was not an exception. It was a condition of life itself. And yet, within that condition, people still created order. They swept floors that would be dirty again within hours. They aired rooms that would soon fill with smoke and breath. They washed hands that would return to labor almost immediately. They changed linen, arranged spaces, cleared paths, managed waste, and repeated those actions day after day. Not because they believed they could eliminate dirt, but because they understood that even temporary order mattered, that a room could feel better for a while, that a path could be easier to walk, that a body could be more comfortable even if only briefly, and that those moments, small as they were, made life more bearable. Over time, those small acts accumulated, not into a clean world, but into a more aware one. A world where dirt was no longer just endured, but observed, anticipated, and, in limited ways, guided. A world where people began to recognize patterns, how dirt moved, where it settled, how it returned, and responded with practices that shaped their environment, even if they could never fully control it. And from that awareness came something quietly important. Not a sudden transformation, not a break from the past, but a gradual expansion of what seemed possible. Because once people experienced even a slight improvement, a clearer room, a more stable surface, a more manageable space, that experience stayed with them. It became something they could aim for again, something they could repeat, something they could pass on. And in that repetition, across generations, the medieval environment slowly began to change. Not through a single invention or idea, but through countless small decisions: how to build, how to arrange, how to maintain, how to respond. Each one shaped by the same question that had been present all along. How do you live comfortably in a world that is always, quietly, becoming dirty again? And perhaps that is the most revealing part of the story, because the answer was never perfection. It was persistence. A steady, patient effort to create moments of order within a system that resisted it. A willingness to accept limits without abandoning improvement. A way of living that balanced realism with quiet ambition. And when we look back at that world, not through the lens of what it lacked, but through the lens of how people moved within it, we begin to see something different. Not just a past defined by dirt, but a past defined by the effort to manage it. An effort that never truly ended, but continued, slowly, unevenly shaping the spaces people inhabited, the routines they followed, and the expectations they carried forward into the worlds that came after. And in that sense, the story does not really end at all. Because the question it raises, how to live within an environment that is always changing, always producing new challenges, remains familiar, even now. Only the conditions have changed. The quiet work of managing them continues.